Hello once again to the history of comic books, and I'm continuing the video that I started to do yesterday, where I'm showing my origins as a comic book reader and collector, and showing off some important important items from my formative years. They're not very important in historically, but they're important to me. And the video yesterday was getting a bit long, so I decided to cut it short and start with save something for today. And I'm going to show off some items from my collection that reinforced my interest in comic books and that lay the groundwork for me to uh, accept that comic books was something that I was going to read for many years to come, especially because the regular comics at the time, in the mid 90s, they started going down in quality, and I even thought for a couple of times that maybe I should quit. Maybe everybody was right. You're supposed to stop reading comics, but there were other things that I could read, and I didn't actually pick them up when they came out. I picked them up a few years later, which is actually good because I would not have been able to appreciate them had I read them when I was 9 or 10. So one of one of the things that the Brazilian comics that we had in Portugal uh, were different from American comics was that they were digest-sized anthologies with 3 or 4 stories per comic, but they were smaller. So when the publisher finally had the opportunity to start producing comics in the American regular format, they sold it to the public as a deluxe format, which kind of worked well because that was how they were able to launch a few different collections. But so the first comic that they did, I didn't buy it. I don't own a single issue of it. And in fact, the character, I only read some of the original issues that appeared in the smaller format, which was good because it was the Roy Thomas, Barry Windsor Smith run. But then when it moved to the Savage Sword of Conan, I didn't read it. So this is my first collection of Conan comics, which I bought years later. And it's a good idea that they did this. These are great stories from the Savage Sword run with art by John Buscema. And these were actually the best. They had a regular magazine for a regular short, smaller magazine for Conan the Barbarian, and the bigger one and a black and white for Savage Sword, which was the biggest draw. This black and white this black and white art was amazing, and so I'm glad I waited a few years to actually start reading this because I was actually able to appreciate it more, and the fact that nobody's wearing a uniform because I was all about superheroes when I was 9 or 10. I could have bought Watchmen and I didn't, and it's a good thing. I only read Watchmen in the mid '90s, so better experience. The Savage Sword of Conan opened the floor for Epic, which I showed you in my video about Epic's early years, which you can find in my list of videos. If you want to go down the list and see if you can find something that you might find interesting. And the first thing that they did was launch this magazine that was much bigger, and which they launched to showcase some stories that were published in black and white magazines like Savage Tales and Marvel Preview and Bizarre Adventures. This one was the first one that I bought. It features Paradox by I'm sorry, I forgot about by Bill Mantlo and Val Mayerick, and this is now probably one of the most obscure Marvel characters. Marvel has reprinted a lot of stuff from the 70s, including Star-Lord, who became famous thanks to the movies, but also Weird World, and recently, a couple of years ago, they even published a collection of stories featuring Greenberg the Vampire, which I thought, man, you can go to further than the bottom of the barrel for that. And the only character that still needs to be reprinted, I guess, is Paradox. There are two stories that appeared in Marvel Preview and Bizarre Adventures. This is one of them, except the whole comic. It's a science fiction story, and it has that typical late 70s, early 80s disco visuals that we enjoyed so much. And they stayed with this type of material for the first 13 issues, always Marvel. They even ran the RoboCop movie adaptation. There was an issue dedicated to called The Conqueror. As well, there was one with Thor on the cover. Getting the association with superheroes and the Robert E. Howard characters. I'll try to sell this magazine. But from issue number 14, they changed directions and they licensed a material that was published in Spain in the magazine CMOC, which is Comic Backwards. And this is what I wanted to show. Or is it? Well, yes, it is. So looks like a generic cover, but it was produced in house, and it was my first contact with a lot of different material that I was not aware of, and they still ran a few stories from Savage Tales Volume 2 after the switch to the Spanish material, including a couple of Bucky Bizarre features and War Toy with art by George Perez. But mostly this was Spanish and some Brazilian material. This was how I found out about Manfred Sommer's Frank Capra, war correspondent. And it also features art by Brazilian author Mozart Couto. This one, Vince Waller and John Arcudi. It ran in Savage Tales Volume 2. This is a story by Mike Deodato and his father. Not at all what you'd expect from Deodato. It's a completely different style. Let's see a couple more pages around. Nothing like you'd expect Mike Deodato to do. Here's another Spanish feature, Morgan, kind of like Torpedo, but set in the present day of the 1980s. Here, Morgan is in jail. There was a lot of crime noir and some psychedelic science fiction, the type that you'd read in Metallic Blanc and in its American version, Heavy Metal. The following issue, number 18. I think this cover was also produced in-house. No, this one is CMOC. This one's from CMOC. And this magazine didn't have much in the way of permanent characters. They started running the NAM here, but apart from that, and a couple of Blood and Guts stories from Savage Tales Volume 2, there were no recurring characters. they tried to change that with the Spanish art, with the Spanish stories, and there were a few stories featuring both Morgan and Frank Capra, which was probably the best material that they could run. There were a lot of other features that ran in the magazine. It was a typical European magazine in that you either ran a short story or you ran a full story for broken up in chapters for a number of issues. Then you'd stop and you'd come back a year later and do another one. But Morgan, like Frank Capra, they usually ran short stories, and they did another short story a few months later. There's some more Morgan. Since this was all black and white, there had use of shadows, of course. So this is not going to appear very well in the camera, unfortunately. Here's another short story from CMOC. One of the things that I noticed in the Spanish stories that they ran was that they were trying to exercise a lot of the authors were trying to exercise a lot of the demons that were still with them from their fascist period, from the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, and there were constant references to the Spanish Civil War and its following period. Okay, so I mentioned Bucky Bizarre. Here it is. Not my favorite. And here's another Frank Capra story. This is my favorite Frank Capra story, The Last African. Frank Capra is something that I'd love to see published in a full volume. IDW currently has the Euro Comics line, and they've been using it to run the reprints of Corto Maltese, and I own an integral volume with another CMOC character, Dieter Lumpen. It's also created in Spain by the same artist that is currently working on Corto Maltese. But if they did that, they should do Frank Capra. There's an Antegal volume that was produced by Glénat for the Spanish and for the French market, and it's just a question of getting the license and translating it. Another story by Giral and Ucero. There were usually there wasn't a theme connecting all the stories. They ran what they wanted. So it was a question of having enough material to fill out the pages, and as long as there was an large overall quality, it didn't matter what they published. Here's another by Brazilian artist Mozart Couto. The Brazilians were starting to be known at the time, and there was a studio trying to find them all work, and this being the late 80s, there was a lot of interest. The Brazilians had an industry that was good enough for the Brazilians to try out. In fact, they produced their own stories for He-Man, and after the American magazines were canceled. And I think they did Brave Star in-house as well. Okay. So this is it for Aventura e Ficção. This magazine was being black and white. It would not reach its full potential audience. There are some natural barriers to reading in black and white. So, but they had a good a good place to shoot higher, aim higher for a new line, and that's what they did with those so-called deluxe stories. One of those were that they wanted to run were the graphic novels. Started with the series graphic novel, then they tried graphic album when graphic novel became mostly for European comics. Graphic album was trying to be a little more on the alternative side, and they ran a separate series only for Marvel graphic novels. But these still started in the regular first graphic novel series. The first one that they published was God Loves, Man Kills. See, this did not have spines. They were published as a large magazine, and some stories were 64 pages, some stories were 48. So they ran a Parable by the Silver Surfer story in here. Also, the fifth issue was a DC story. Their first DC story in this line was The Killing Joke. But they did a lot more. They tried out American Flag. Here's Iron Man Crash. The story is not very interesting. It was just an opportunity to try out Mike Sains's computer design. This, with the technology of the time, this was terrible. Now it looks terrible. It looks dated. Then it looked kind of fresh. And they also ran the Shadow graphic novel that was published at Marvel, and the Rocketeer, which was quite amusing. I read this. I was familiar with the character because of the Disney movie. So when I bought this, man, I want to read this. This actually gave birth to my interest in pulp and post-war atomic age stories from in the 30s and the 50s. Now the Deluxe comics, a lot of them were Batman stories because DC had just launched the Elseworlds line. So one of the first stories that they ran in Brazil was also Gotham by Gaslight, which they published as Gotham City 1889, and The Good, the Great, and the Bad. Very lighthearted. There are a lot of jokes about the Lone Ranger here. It's actually quite fun when you compare that around the same time they were publishing The Killing Joke. You'll also notice here that they created their own logo for Elseworld stories. They called it O Túnel do Tempo, Time Tunnel. They ended up running a few other stories. Cable, Blood, and Metal was published here. Captain America Punisher crossover was also in this format. There was something else I thought I had here, but turns out I don't. Oh, do I? What was that? No, I didn't bring it in. That's okay. So this was stuff that I bought during the 90s that was different from the Marvel superheroes, and during the 90s I basically stayed with superheroes. There was the launch of Image Comics, and I already showed in my History of Wildstorm series the magazines that launched Wildcats and Gen 13 for the Brazilian market, and many of them arrived here in Portugal as well. But the Marvel's bankruptcy in 1996 left the Portuguese market for comic books in disarray. All of a sudden, we stopped getting Marvel. We didn't know why. We didn't know what was going on at the time. The internet was still in its infancy, and companies didn't have email addresses. So I took the opportunity to try out the comics that were available in English. There were some stores that imported magazines from abroad, including newsstand editions of Marvel and DC comics. So since the market was favorable for it, I started looking into the possibility of reading in English, which I did. I bought this is Fantastic Four number 410. It's not not very important. This just happens to be the first comic book that I read in English. I could have started reading in English earlier. By age 11 or 12, I was pretty much fluent as a reader. But since I was following the main continuity and we were a couple of years behind, I was not interested in breaking up that flow. But I saw all those magazines that appeared in the newsstand that was specialized in foreign magazines, but I didn't pick them up. So I tried this one. This was just before Onslaught, so it still looked fairly normal. It's still the Tom DeFalco, Paul Ryan era, and they had just gotten Reed Richards back from the dead. Still, it took me a few months until I finally got into the groove of things and decided I'm going to start reading American comics, the original ones, on a regular basis. And since I was always a fan of the Avengers when I was growing up, I decided I was going to buy this. It was going back to normal. I read a few of the Heroes Reborn issues. They were terrible. People complain about Liefeld on Captain America. You should see his clone, Chap Yip, on the Avengers. It was the most dreadful art that I've ever seen. Those stories made absolutely no sense. And we just wanted the Avengers to be back to normal. And that's what we got here. Avengers number 1. This was quite a success at the time. It signaled the return to the real Marvel Universe, respect for the characters. Unfortunately, by making this a number 1, they also created the current market condition where you can't have a comic that lasts for a long time, or that you can't pick it up. Now they were always going to launch a new number 1 for you. And finally, something that I took the opportunity when I found it in a bookstore. My first trade paperback was Squadron Supreme. This is the first printing, the one that has Mark Gruenwald's ashes in it. And one of these days, I'm going to do a video on it. And I like the Squadron Supreme from their appearances in the Avengers. And this miniseries was something that I had heard mentioned in the letter columns during the 80s and 90s, but became forgotten. The Squadron Supreme didn't appear much in the 90s. And it was actually quite surprising that I found is that Marvel launched this because they had a terrible policy on publishing trades in the late 90s compared to DC. People were always complaining that they would publish a trade that nobody asked for, or they would launch something that sounded interesting, but there was no follow-up. I remember once that Marvel announced that they were going to do a special edition called X-Men Road Trips, and with the best X-Men on the road stories. There wasn't even a full storyline, and people were on the internet complaining, Marvel needs to reprint classic Avengers stories. We want Avengers pre-Skrull War, which we finally got a few years later. So, but this opened up the world for me to start getting collections, which is now my favorite format for picking up storylines. So I see a lot of videos on the internet with people picking up comic book hauls, especially those that find key issues from the past or complete runs. And here in Portugal, I can't go on the hunt. I could probably buy from the internet, but I don't think it's the same thing. And since I need to be practical in the way I buy storylines, I would rather be a collector of comic book stories than a collector of comic books. and I don't keep my comics in Mylars, and so I need to watch out for them and not touch them very much. And that's it. That's the end of my origin story. Yesterday's video ran for 40 minutes, 40 something minutes, and I'm not going to do a half an hour today. So thank you very much for staying with me. Please leave some comments if you want to as well. Also let me know. And we'll be back one of these days. I'm probably going to do something Kirby. I haven't done something with Kirby. And I think that the fourth world is the ideal thing for it. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, keep reading old comics.